My name is Dr. Kaeli Swift, and I am a postdoctoral researcher specializing in avian ecology and behavior at the University of Washington.
Hello and welcome to the Seattle Bird Podcast. I'm your host, Leo. Recently, I had the chance to talk to Dr. Kaeli Swift. She's a corvid researcher currently studying Tinian monarchs. This week's episode focuses more on corvids, whereas the episode next week, part 2, will be more about her research on the Tinian monarch. Okay, and what was your spark bird?
Ooh, that's such a good question. Honestly, probably my spark bird was chickadees because those are the ones that I remember most fondly watching when I was a kid at my grandma's bird feeder. And that's what really got me interested in the idea that there were all these different species of birds and you could identify what they were and keep track of them and which ones you saw and where. And so not the answer people are expecting of a corvid specialist, but it was chickadees.
And how long have you been birding recreationally?
Well, I have sort of a storied history with birding because I did a lot of it as a kid, and then I went through this kind of phase in late middle school, high school, where I didn't do it at all, and I sort of had prioritized other things in my life, and it really wasn't until college that I got back into it more earnestly. So I've been sort of an on-again, off-again birder. I had a little bit of a dark phase where I turned my back on the birds, but I've since returned.
Yeah, so you're an expert on corvids. So I'd just like you to ask you some questions about crows. Sometimes I see a few hundred crows gathering in nearby trees and making a racket. Why do they do that?
So that depends on a couple of things. There could be a couple answers. So generally when people ask me that question, the first thing I check in about is the time of day. And often the response will be, oh, it was kind of first thing in the morning, or it was getting towards evening. And if that's the case, often what you're seeing is so crows do something that a minority of other birds do, which is called communal roosting. So even though crows have their own territories that they maintain during the day, at night, they all get together in these big slumber parties. And so there's this whole mechanism in place on the way to the roost from their individual territories. It's a very social affair. And one of the components of that process is called the pre-roost aggregation. And so that's often when you're seeing groups of, 100 or more crows kind of in the trees, or especially in parking lots, construction sites. Towards the evening, that's what you're seeing. The other possibility is if it's just the middle of the day and they're being really noisy and they sound upset, the tone of their calling is very harsh, then the most likely explanation is that there's a predator tucked away into that tree. Maybe it's an owl, maybe it's a raccoon, maybe it's another type of bird of prey, and they are collectively just sort of drawing attention to it and trying to evict it from the area.
What is something important people often get wrong about crows?
Ooh, so in an urban-suburban setting like Seattle, I think the most important thing people get wrong about crows is this idea that they are the drivers of a reduction in other types of backyard songbirds. And the reason I say other types of backyard songbirds is, and this is another thing people often just assume incorrectly about crows, crows are actually a type of songbird. They're in the same order along with robins and chickadees and all of that. But a lot of people think that because they will see crows eating particularly the nests of other birds, which is absolutely a thing that they do, they're a generalist predator, and everything likes to eat eggs, even things that tell you that they otherwise only eat grass. If given the opportunity, most of those things will eat a bird's nest if they happen upon it, because eggs are an amazing nutritional source. And so when birds depredate nests, especially because they are diurnal or daytime predators, that's very visible to us. And that is understandably devastating if you've been watching that robin's nest or whatever it is in your backyard. Like, it hurts to see those babies get eaten, to see those parents alarm calling. And that can create a lot of sort of misplaced vitriol towards crows, and this idea that crows are single-handedly sort of driving down local songbird populations. And that's as a question, as a premise, that is a really important thing to vet and explore and see, is there truth to that? And we've done a lot of what's called predator removal studies or other kinds of studies to examine that. And in the vast majority of cases, particularly in suburban settings, it's just not true. And even if you evict all of the crows from the area, we see the same levels of predation on those other types of songbirds. So that would definitely be one thing I want to communicate to people, is just that crows aren't sort of this in most cases, they're not sort of this overbearing predator that is sometimes easy to think of them as. Now, that said, that is a really important reason why, if you were going to offer bird food and crow-specific bird food, you never want to over-supplement them and invite more crows into your neighborhood than would normally be occurring there, because in those cases, you can then have an overextended impact on other kinds of songbirds in your neighborhood.
So when the crows are removed, would other predators just step up and just eat the extra eggs?
Exactly. So the ecology term that we would use for that is this idea of additive or compensatory mortality, where additive means that our group in question, say crows, they are adding an additional burden that wouldn't normally be there on a population, on a prey population, versus compensatory means that it's sort of filling a niche, but even if you took that one away, that would immediately be filled by the other predators in the area at the same level. And in Seattle, those other kinds of predators are things like squirrels. And we often, because squirrels are just not as conspicuous about it as crows are, we often underestimate the impact that eastern gray squirrels, which is a non-native species here on the West Coast, have on our songbirds, but it's pretty pronounced. Raccoons, of course, cats, right? There's a whole variety, jays, there's a whole variety of other kinds of nest predators in our area too.
So if the squirrels were removed, would the crows also step up and eat those extra eggs?
Probably. No one's done that specific study in Seattle to look at the consequences of eastern gray squirrel nest predation, as far as I know. But we could imagine that might be the case, or maybe squirrels are having more of an additive effect. No one's looked at that yet.
Moving on, so you run a blog about corvids. Listeners should check that out for sure. Are there any great stories from the blog you might want to tell on this show?
Oh, so I mostly use the blog to relay more like science facts and review papers and stuff. But certainly the comment sections are just absolutely full of people sharing they're from like crow people sharing all of their really interesting stories. In terms of some of my favorite articles that I've published, one that I really enjoyed writing was looking at UV vision in crows. This is something I've actually been recently talking about on my social media channels. So because crows are all black, and a lot of people are aware of the fact that, the way we see the world is not necessarily the same way other kinds of animals see the world, right? There's this whole section of light that we can't see, and that's the ultraviolet section, right? So we have we have VS systems, which is visual systems, and then UVS systems, which is ultraviolet systems. And a lot of animals and birds can see that part of the UV spectrum. And so a lot of people, when they look at a crow and they see that it's all black, they go, well, since birds can see UV, part of the UV spectrum, they probably don't just look black to each other. And so I would get asked that a lot, or I would see people sort of making that claim a lot. And it's funny, for how much work and research has been done on crows. I mean, they're one of the most accessible study organisms, in America. There are still so many questions that seem really basic that you think, oh, I bet I could just Google that and find an answer, and you can't. It's because maybe people have extensively studied that in other kinds of birds, but it can be very hard to get scientific resources that speak specifically to crows. So it takes a lot of work to sort of go ping around from here to here to here and kind of put all the pieces together to then be able to apply it to American crows specifically. So I did that for that article, and it was just an interesting one to research. And ultimately what I found is that corvids, for whatever reason, despite being closely related to birds with very acute UV spectrum vision, don't have that. And so there's no reason to think that when they look at each other, they're seeing something other than a black bird.
How do crows get along with ravens?
Ooh, good question. Not well. And there was actually a really cool paper that came out 3 or 4 years ago now that used eBird data, which tracked antagonistic, aggressive interactions between ravens and crows to try and sort of quantify who the typical aggressor is and how often it happens. And what they found is that typically crows are the aggressor. And yes, they absolutely, if a crow comes into the area, and I see this a lot in Seattle because we are a crow-biased city. We do get ravens occasionally, particularly if you go to places like West Seattle, Discovery Park, go out to Issaquah. And we even get ravens in more centralized areas, like I've seen them in Crossroads in Bellevue. But most of what we have is crows, and so when they see those errant ravens come in, they absolutely harass them and try and get them out of there. And the reason for that is ravens are nest predators of crows.
Oh, so is this like one crow like attacking one raven, or like multiple crows attacking one raven?
So typically when crows attack a predator, they do it as a group, and the word for that behavior is mobbing. Crows aren't the only birds that do that. Lots of other songbirds will sort of do this attack in numbers strategy. You might see like an individual crow going after a raven, but generally speaking, you're going to see it in a group.
Crows and ravens don't get along well.
No.
Crows attack ravens, but when there's more ravens than crows, do the ravens like win?
So it doesn't look like, when there's more ravens than crows, it doesn't really look like ravens generally initiate attacks on adult crows. They're gonna win in the sense that they are gonna be eating a lot of the crows' babies, but they don't generally instigate aerial attacks the same way crows instigate aerial attacks.
Do other corvids like get into fights with other corvids?
Absolutely, yeah. You'll see magpies, and it kind of depends on the relationships, but they're certainly not the only two corvids that will sort of go head to head with each other if the occasion arises.
And I see crows like hanging out with other birds, but like peacefully. Do they ever attack like birds besides ravens?
Sure, yeah, and really any kind of raptor. Owls, I see them do it with bald eagles. There was a cool study that John Marsliff and Jack DeLapp out of UW did many years ago now, looking at their behaviors towards osprey. So osprey are a fish-eating raptor, right? I mean, like sometimes they branch out and eat other things, but mostly ospreys eat fish, which means that if you're a crow, you shouldn't be spending your time harassing osprey because they don't eat you, they eat fish. And so they did this study to try and look at how prolific that behavior is in areas where osprey are more common and areas where osprey are only present, part of the year. Osprey as a whole are migratory, but obviously if you live closer to water, then you would have more experience with osprey than if you live further from water. And they found that crows who had more experience with osprey tend to attack them less than crows with less experience with osprey, which is interesting because it suggests this idea that, their baseline is to just recognize the raptorness in them, and it's actually through experience that they learn like, oh, I shouldn't actually bother doing that. That bird doesn't eat me.
Are crows known to attack like ducks and geese?
No, they don't really attack them. I mean, they'll especially ducklings, they'll, go after the babies, but I guess I have seen crows and geese sort of, I've had somebody send me a picture of a crow and a goose sort of like having a moment of conflict, but it's not like a super common thing. The way that seeing them going after an eagle, a bald eagle, is a pretty common thing.
There's like a common lore that like crows can remember your face. Like, how true is this?
It's very true. So that study was done again by John Marsliff at the University of Washington. And the way that they tested that is they would wear masks. In the initial study, they wore these sort of caricatured masks of Halloween masks of a caveman and a politician, and they would capture crows and put individual color markers on them and do all of the measurements. And that as an experience for a bird, we as scientists try and make that experience as quick and harmless as possible. But of course the birds don't like it; they're not happy. So that's a pretty traumatic thing to be captured and handled. And so the researchers were assuming that might be enough of a negative experience that if they could remember faces, that'd be the kind of face you'd want to remember, right? That seems like a pretty harmful person in the bird's perspective. And so then they would let the birds go. And they would come back then in the mask that they trapped them in, or in a mask that they'd never seen before, and tested the difference in reaction. And what they found was that crows were very reactive to the mask that had been used during the trapping experience, and they ignored the mask that they had never seen before. And eventually they expanded the study to use masks that were much more lifelike rather than more exaggerated, like a Halloween mask of a politician is. And they found the same thing. And really interesting, they found that not only did the birds that were trapped originally, respond pretty consistently to seeing these faces, but over time, the number of crows that would alarm call, dive bomb, do all of the things, all of the behaviors consistent with crows seeing somebody that they identify as threatening was increasing over time, which meant that the information that this individual was bad was being spread through the community. Now, a lot of people take that to mean that crows are having these sort of off-site conversations where they're describing people, and we don't have evidence that that's what's going on. Probably what it is knowledgeable birds see that mask, they start alarm calling. Naive birds that don't know what's going on, they come in because they hear the commotion and they're watching, and it's through that observational experience that they're like, oh, I don't know what the deal is necessarily. I don't know why they're so mad at that person, but they're real mad at that person. So I guess they're dangerous, and I'm just going to assume they're dangerous too. And if I see them again, then I'll sound the alarm.
Do any of your fellow corvid researchers, did any of them somehow get on the crow's blacklist?
Well, so that was definitely one of the main benefits of wearing the masks. And in all my studies, we wore masks too. And often when we trapped crows, for other work that was being done. So, for example, I have a colleague who did more learning experiments with crows. So we had to trap crows, and he kept them in captivity for a limited period of time. We would always make sure to wear masks during that period because, it would be very hard if you trapped a bunch of crows in your regular face, so to speak, and then you were trying to interact with them later. They might be just unwilling to participate because they're like, hey, you jerk, I remember you from before. So we would definitely try our best to not get on their blacklist.
Wouldn't you start running out of costumes once the crows learn those costumes all are bad?
Well, so that was the importance of drawing on different populations of crows and sort of being thoughtful about where we were using the masks and what masks we had used in areas. And so, it took a lot of sort of work and scheduling to make sure that kind of thing didn't happen. But we had, I'm trying to remember how many faces we had to choose from. Maybe six? So it was, that wasn't as hard as you might think, but it did take a little bit of work and good note keeping to make sure that, we were always, if we needed to be using a mask, we were using a mask that the birds in that particular area would not be familiar with.
When you did, when there was research on crows at University of Washington, like which population of crows did they generally sample from?
All over the place. So we would often, if we just needed to catch a bunch of birds, we would go up near Bothell to the roost and try and catch birds as they were leaving the roost if we, say, needed to catch a bunch at one time. For my experiments, when I was doing the funeral stuff, because that's my background, I looked at why crows respond to dead crows and quantify what that looks like and tried to get at some of the evolutionary or adaptive reasons behind that. So what I did for those studies is I was all over Seattle, Kirkland, Bellevue, South Seattle, all over the place. And I would make sure that I was always targeting a different individual pair and putting enough space, because we have an estimate of territory size, which is in Seattle basically like a square block, putting enough space between each individual experiment that I wasn't getting overlapping individuals.
So how come I rarely see like baby or juvenile crows?
Probably because you don't know how to recognize them. So a really common misconception about baby birds is, I think, especially for people who don't consider themselves birders or who are new to birding, I think the most common baby bird that we are exposed to is something like a duckling or a chicken chick, right? Like those images of those birds are everywhere, especially in like children's books. And so we grow up with this idea that baby birds are really distinctive and easy to identify from adults. Or the images we have is of a bird in a nest, right? Where it's naked. And again, this idea that baby birds are really distinctive. The reason then that translates to a lot of people thinking they've never seen, baby pigeon or baby crow or whatever it is before, is that for those birds, for birds that are altricial, so there are two different strategies, altricial and precocial. And altricial means that you're born naked and helpless, like humans are, like baby robins are, baby crows, et cetera, et cetera. Or there's precocial, which is that when you are born or you hatch, you're pretty ready to go out of the gate, right? Like a little duckling, fully covered in down, it's ready to run around, or a baby chicken, that kind of thing. But for those altricial species that, hatch and then have a extended period of time in the nest, by the time they leave the nest, they're actually pretty close to their full adult size. And so when they're out then in your neighborhood and you're looking around, you look up on the telephone wire and there's like a pretty big black bird just sitting there. And if you didn't know to look for a few kind of subtle features, it would be very easy to just be like, I don't know, it's a crow. It looks like every other crow. But the key features then to look for are baby crows for our first couple months out, once they leave the nest, have blue eyes rather than brown. Now, if the bird's far away, you're not going to be able to notice that. But if it's right there on the sidewalk in your front yard or wherever, you can see that, or if you get a picture of it. The other feature is that they have pink in their mouth corners, and the interior of their mouths are going to be bright pink or bright red. So if they're making any noise, if they're calling, you'll see this really conspicuous flash of color, versus adult crows have pure black lining. And the reason for that is lots of baby birds have really flashy mouth interiors, because it's a very strong, attractive signal that tells the parents that they should put food here. I'm hungry. Do you see this color? That means I'm the one that needs the food. And so, so we see that. And some birds, you could Google Gouldian finch, have just incredibly bizarre and wild mouth interiors for that reason. And then the last feature is, and this takes more practice, it's more subtle, but this is a really, really helpful one, especially for birds that are kind of like far away, or if you don't have a very good camera, is they tend to, even though overall they're going to be about as big as an adult, their tail, especially when they first leave the nest, much shorter. So they kind of have these stubby tails, and overall their plumage, it's not as nice. when you see a crow, particularly like around, right now all the crows in Seattle probably look like crap because it's after the breeding season, so they're all going through their annual molt. And they're scruffy as heck, they're missing tail feathers, primary feathers, they look bad. But by December, they're all gonna look glossy, beautiful, iridescent. And so if you've ever paid attention to crows, you may have noticed that in the right light, they're just this beautiful kind of iridescent. You can see a little purple, a little blue. Baby crows don't have that because baby feathers, that first, what we call formative plumage, it grows so fast that it's not particularly high quality feathers. And though that level of iridescence takes a lot of, well, we don't have to get into the sort of specifics of it, but just suffice it to say that first round of feathers that they grow, they're not as high of quality, and so they don't tend to be very shiny. And so if the bird has kind of matte black instead of shiny black, that's another good indication that it's a baby.
If you're interested in hearing the rest of the interview, tune back in next week for part 2. Until next time.